So I'm Tally Woodward. I'm the director of the MA program. I sort of deal with the organizational and academic side of things. Here with me today are Professor David Haydu, who's one of the arts concentration professors, and also a 30-year-long arts writer, and who's written 4 books.
You don't have to rub it in.
No, it's a good thing.
Yeah.
And Nicholas Lemon, who was until last summer the dean of the journalism school and really founded the MA program and came up with the idea for it. And he teaches evidence and inference, which is a class that all of the MA students take in the fall, and originated that class. And starting this next year, he's going to be teaching the politics seminar in the spring. And he's actually technically on sabbatical this year, but agreed to come back to talk to you all. So I'm going to just ask them a few questions to kind of get things going, but we would love for you guys to ask questions too, and then we'll leave some time at the end.
Can you all just introduce yourselves quickly?
Thanks. So can you sort of tell us what compelled you to create this program and what sort of the idea, what you thought was lacking in journalism education?
Yeah, that's pretty easy. If you're really interested in the history of journalism education, one of the things I did on my sabbatical was write a report on journalism education, past, present, and future, with two other ex-deans, which you can find online, and it's the most complete account, which isn't saying a lot because there's no competition, of the entire history of journalism education. But basically what happened is, when this school started, so Joseph Pulitzer announced the gift in 1903, and the school actually opened in 1912, and the reason for that was that he was a great man, but he was what we call in university administration a difficult donor. And he was one of these people like, Hyman Roth in The Godfather, who spent about 20 years dying. So after about a year of his announcing the gift, he and the president of the university decided they'd just kind of wait till he actually did die before they opened the school, because he wanted to be able to name the faculty and, et cetera, et cetera. So there was this sort of gap. But when he made the announcement, as would happen today, I think there was this huge controversy about whether there should be journalism education. This was at a time when most journalists hadn't even been to college and many hadn't been to high school. So it seemed sort of nutty. Both parts of what he did, we're in this room, I think, or maybe upstairs. They're going to announce the Pulitzer Prize winners on Monday. That was created also in 1903, and that was also regarded as nutty. There was a big, the then most prominent sort of intellectual magazine was called the North American Review, and there was a big article attacking Pulitzer's gift by a now long forgotten but then very famous journalist named Horace White. And so Pulitzer felt he had to reply, so the North American Review gave him space, and he wrote this essay sort of defending himself against the critics of the idea, also in 1903. And no, it came out in 1904. And there's lots of copies floating around if you want. It's a really, really wonderful essay, and it kind of states the case for the MA program very well. In other words, there's always been a kind of fight in journalism education between whether it should be about skills, how to write a feature story, how to write a news story, or whether it should be about mastering the substance of difficult subjects. And of course, as a school, we've always sort of hedged our bets, but the early years of the school, it was very much Pulitzer's vision. And then within about 5 years, it had switched to more the trade school model. The room where you just were was set up as a newsroom, and there was like a riser, and there were desks like this, and there were city editors with green eye shades, and every student had a desk, and the city editor would send you out to do stories, and you'd come back and they'd edit the stories, and that was what the school did. So it's essential to have these skills, which have changed somewhat over time, but particularly if you're in a university, there's a sort of missing piece historically in journalism education, which is teaching journalists how to understand and cover complicated subjects substantively. And everybody in the world who isn't a journalist, including possibly members of your own families, thinks journalism isn't good enough on these very grounds. And a university is a great instrument for correcting that problem. So the theory of the MA program was find people who already have the basic news writing skills, some of whom would be coming out of the MS program at the school and for them from the outside world, and give them more of an ability to master complicated subjects. This partly comes out of my own experience in journalism, which is a feeling often over the years that I'd be a little bit lost, or I'd make big mistakes when trying, you'd sort of get up the food chain from cat stuck in tree type stories into things that are more complicated, and you'd have to be fairly adept at understanding a complicated subject, and it's not something that's naturally that people in newsrooms know about, and that is taught in journalism school. So there's kind of, for me, what I wish somebody had taught me element here, and it's still, as a teacher in the program, since the program didn't exist before, I've kind of been a student in the program secretly as well as a teacher, and I'm still, a practicing journalist, and I think that working with the program has helped me enormously in journalism, to be a journalist. I write for the New Yorker, and I get sent around to do, well, when I was dean, I would do a different story every summer on a different topic. So, the summer of 2011, I was sent to write about Brazil. And the summer of 2012, I was sent to write about Mitt Romney. And the summer of 2013, I was sent to write about the Securities and Exchange Commission. And now I'm writing about the Federal Reserve Board. So all these are things where you just can't say, I want to write about, whoever I'm writing about, what they do for a hobby, and things like that. You want to write about the substance of what they actually do, and for that, the set of skills we try to confer in the MA program are really helpful, I think.
I'd just like to echo that I had the same kind of experience, that I had some journalism education, formal journalism education at NYU, which is where I went to college as an undergraduate. But then I learned mostly through practice, and found, like every journalist I know, that there's a point when you're covering a story and you don't know what, first of all, you don't know things that you need to know, and then secondarily, you start to realize that you don't even know what you don't know. So it's it's a fairly complicated problem, and the solution becomes, the options for solution one faces are, gee, do I fake it? Do I cover this sort of lightly and glance over the topics? Do I turn to somebody quickly and try to make a fast study of this? Or can I postpone the story and make a deep study of this and do a better job. And I found that in my own experience and the experience of many of my peers, we just had no choice but to take the easy route, just for expediency's sake, to meet the deadline. And there were times when I had to write about a case that went before the Supreme Court over the legality of home videotaping. Early in my career, I was, I think, younger than you folks, in the 1980s. And I just had a bear of a time trying to understand copyright law. There were times when I made a turn from reporting to be a critic when I began to realize how much I didn't know about aesthetics and about aesthetic theory, and I had to just slowly learn. And you could almost see in my writing that I started to figure out what I was talking about over several years' time. So as Nick said, we've devised the curriculum partly as a dream curriculum for ourselves. What do we wish we had the opportunity? What do we wish we knew or we could have learned?
I would just add, you know, when this discussion used to take place before we had this program, people would always say, well, if you want to learn how to cover X subject, just go to another unit of the university and study it there. I think there's a really big difference between that and the MA program in favor of the MA program for journalists, and it's really two things. The secondary reason is that we can sort of select for what's most useful for journalists. That is, as a tiny example, if you go to business school, I am told, not having been, it's really important to take a course in depreciation of assets. That's not something you're going to cover as a reporter, almost certainly, but learning to read a corporate balance sheet is something you're going to have to cover, so we can do that kind of selection. But the most important thing is just the constant act of mapping the substance and the expertise onto actual journalistic work. So the problem with studying elsewhere is your work is term papers, and so you have to sort of say, well, I'm going to extrapolate some other time. Whereas in this program, with everything you do, but particularly the thesis project, you're performing that act under our direction all the time, and figuring out how to create the link between expert knowledge, context, etc., and actual journalism that reads and feels like journalism. And that's a big value of this program.
So to break that down into practical terms, in terms of what we do, each week in the MA, in the Arts and Culture seminar, the students read over 100 pages of readings for each session. That's 2 sessions a week. And there are readings of a variety of kinds. There are intellectual readings, scholarly readings, academic readings. We'll read Foucault, we read Derrida, but then there's journalism, reporting, and not just print reporting and print journalism, but we draw on audio and video resources too. And then in the seminar, we're talking and thinking about issues. We take up a different issue each week, but all of the assignments are journalistic. For instance, I'll give you an example of how this plays out. The first term of the MA seminar, we usually end the first term with a final project for the term that's a profile of an artist, now, which is a sort of standard assignment. Everyone is assigned to do a profile at one point. This is a 25 to 3,000 word assignment. But we have armed our students to have thought intelligently about the distinction between the art and the artist, so that they've read Foucault, so that by the time they're doing this, they're not so quick to make glib associations between, oh, the person was born, he or she had a hard scrabble life and an abusive father, and therefore became a punk rock artist. Well, you know, the relationship between the artist and the artist. The art is not the artist, and the relationship is often a lot more complicated, and we dissuade people from making sort of glib inferences through like a deeper understanding of the way that like the mind works and the social influences on a person's development as an artist. So we have really prepared somebody to think more holistically and more complexly. One of our mantras is sort of a little different from what the MS program teaches, is complicate, don't simplify. And I could give a number of other examples of the kinds of how we apply the thinking that we do, the reading, the study, and the discussion we do to journalistic assignments every week.
Yeah, another example that was very much on our minds as we were starting the program, because it was 2003-04, was the war in Iraq. And that just drove me crazy. What I was doing right before being dean here was I was the Washington correspondent for the New Yorker, so I was covering, starting with 9/11 up till March 24th, 2003, when the war in Iraq started. And it just drove me nuts watching the now famous deficiencies of our profession, because all the information about what could go wrong was out there. It was just completely available. It wasn't a secret like Saddam's WMD. It was, this is not a naturally occurring nation, and it has very severe ethnic tensions, and there's all these outside actors. That was all totally available. Nobody went to try to find it. Nobody wrote it. And it's so easy to teach people how to unpack a story like that and cover it in a different way. And now, after these 10 years, we have a lot. Some of our graduates have been out covering, Arab Spring and Syria and all sorts of other world crises, and bringing to that some of this more sophisticated sensibility. So I feel like we've really, proved the concept, at least in instances of people who have done it.
Since you mentioned that, I wonder if each of you could sort of talk a little bit about some of the specific students you've worked with, maybe on their theses in particular.
Poster children.
And to talk about the thesis and how kind of the goals and intent of the thesis project a little bit. Since we're actually in the final sort of crunch for that right now. The theses are due on Monday afternoon, so I'm surprised there actually are MA students who are willing to do the next panel. Everyone's a little bit, doing their final copy editing and everything. But David, do you want to
tell
us about it? Project?
Sure. I'll give you an example of how this is a good example of how the kind of study and thinking that we do over the course of the term bears fruit in a thesis, and this is a nice success story from a recent graduate. I had an advisee last year named Damaris Calhoun, and she started her what she thought was going to be a thesis on veteran art. And she went into the thesis thinking of veteran art as a kind of therapy, which is the way that veteran art is usually portrayed. Through doing art, veterans of the Iraq War or Afghanistan work out their trauma. It has therapeutic value. It's a release. All the ways that art making is usually sort of mapped onto the experience of war trauma, veteran trauma. So she went into that and spent quite a bit of time, several weeks, with a couple of artists who were Iraqi war veterans, and she found one who had done kind of performance art involving a hand grenade that had been deactivated, and he made he staged a fake act of terrorism on the campus as his work of art. That was the work of art. And she came back and did the thesis, and it was pretty much done. It was 8,000 words and had about 1,000 words of a description, maybe 800 words of a description of this event. And through the editing process, and collaboratively, she started to see that there was something special in that act. And as we're talking it over, she said, gee, it's almost like, it reminds me of what we read about the avant-garde feminist art in the 70s. So I said, do you mean that Iraqi war, active Iraqi war art about a hand grenade is feminist? Yeah, I think so. I said, table everything you've had and write that. And she did. So she made an argument that this work of Iraqi war art was a piece of radical feminism, and won the Student Pulitzer that year, and was published almost at full length in The Believer. She used that as a sample of her writing, and had a review of the New York Times Book Review 2 weeks ago. So there's like a nice, happy story of how sort of one fed in the other. Do you have another?
Yeah, and I'll just rattle off a couple quickly. Last year, one of my advisees was a French reporter from Agence France Presse named David Dieudonné, and he wrote a thesis. These stories I'm going to tell you involve getting travel funds, and I don't want to raise false expectations, but we have been able to get travel funds for a lot of these thesis projects and get pretty amazing stuff done. So he did a story on Algerian immigrants in Queens, New York, and Paris, and the differences between these two cultures, which are pretty profound and not that simple. It was a really interesting piece, and he, on the basis of that, partly got hired back by Agence France Presse and promoted to Marseille bureau chief, because it has a lot of Algerians. And then I was just fortunate enough to get a blind email from a book publisher saying, somehow I ran across this thesis and I want to find this guy to sign him to a book contract. So I sent that to David, and I think he's going to turn it into a book. Another example is a student named Rohini Mohan from India. She wrote a thesis, and she just got a book contract. It's about Sri Lanka, which, if you're familiar, has a group that are always described as terrorists called the Tamil Tigers, which was sort of the original really badass terrorist group. And they had been, by the majority government, sort of penned up in the northern end of the island, and then a peace treaty was signed, and all the barriers were taken down, they were reintegrated. And Rohini was somehow able to talk her way into the Tamil camps on the day that the gates were open. She was the only reporter there. And she wrote a wonderful thesis that sort of said, you know, we're obviously, as you can see from the foregoing, we're trying to teach a little skepticism. And she wrote a thesis saying, don't be so sure this integration is going to be so successful, and talked to a lot of people on both sides, but particularly Tamils, about that. One final quick example, just because I was proud of my university. This was not a project I directed, but a few years ago, a student named Victoria Schlesinger wrote a piece very strongly and persuasively questioning a major effort by one of Columbia's big celebrity professors, Jeffrey Sachs, and this is called the Millennium Village Project in Africa. And she wrote this piece, as my kids used to say, casting asparagus on it, and it ran as an article in Harper's, and Jeff Sachs went completely ballistic, and called me and various others, but to his credit, I said, okay, you know, you have made your views known, but we have academic freedom here, so she's publishing the article. And I said, okay, fine. So she did, and it was nice that we could, you know, attack a very well-known Columbia professor.
Don't get any ideas about the company.
Also, just since it's supposed to air this week, one of the arts and culture graduates from last year, Luke Malone, he did an amazing thesis. He's just adapted it for This American Life, and it's going to be sort of, I think, the anchor story on this weekend's episode. So if you guys listen to it, listen out for him. He's an Australian guy, so you should be able to. And
this is a story that, I don't know about you, but frankly, many of us had very strong doubts about the wisdom of his doing this story, which was a sympathetic look at pederasts. I wouldn't put it that way. I would say it's looking at sort of the bind that young men who feel, have pedophilic
feelings are in, since they can't go and speak to their therapists about it without being reported. It's a pretty amazing. He did an
extraordinarily tempered piece.
Yeah, it's a good example of academic freedom, because frankly, several of us said to him, how about a story on a congressional race or something like that? And he was pretty insistent, and we went with him, and he made the sale. He did it. It really is a wonderful, nuanced article that is very unconventional, because the conventional thing to do would be to say, put ankle sensors on these people right now, and that's it.
There's a moment in the thesis, there's a point in the thesis where he's describing some of the images that one of the person who has pedophilic impulses was drawn to and had on his computer. And in the thesis, he described this, and I have to say, I could barely read it. I found it very, very difficult to read. But after getting through it, later in the thesis, he talked about the problem of the lack of treatment in this culture for people with pedophilic impulses, and how most of the cultural response is punitive. That we have very little treatment, and the vividness of that passage and how disturbing that passage was communicated how real and this is as a problem. And he thought it was not easy to just get that through here, but he did it partly through his perseverance and how balanced his treatment was and how tempered his treatment was. There was never sensationalism. He was never luxuriating in the prurience of it, and he wasn't skipping lightly over this subject either. It was just right.
Since we're sort of running low on time, do you have any questions?
The answer is do they stay within the major? Almost always yes, at least in the early years. There's a kind of genteel disagreement about whether journalists should specialize in something for life or not. My boss, the president of the university, when he was hiring me, sort of issued a statement saying he thought journalists should specialize. I don't necessarily agree with that. So you could say you're learning a major, you could say you're sort of learning how to master a complicated subject, and that's transferable, which would be my take. But they do get jobs. So it is a little as you would expect. Journalism, sadly or happily, does not attract the most practical-minded people in the world. The business major, every single business major gets a job in business journalism without fail, and they're often
in New York,
sifting through multiple offers. The arts majors, maybe conventional salaried employment isn't where they're necessarily want to be. So some of them are and some of them aren't. And for some of them it's like a sort of MFA nonfiction with a repertorial rather than memoir writing focus.
But the vast majority of our graduates are working. Many of them have are working as freelancers.
Yeah, they're more likely in the arts major to want that.
But not all. Quite a few have staff jobs too, and a few are entrepreneurs, and they have made their own websites and apps that have been successful.
And we've got quite a few poster children from all the majors. Like in politics, the Washington bureau chief of, the Cairo bureau chief of the Washington Post, Abby Housloner, graduated from the politics MA less than 5 years ago, believe it or not. Another, Haley Edwards, just got hired by Time Magazine after being at the Washington Monthly, and there's a number of
Terry McCoy just got hired by the Washington Post, too.
Yeah,
he
got
was
hired
2
by the
years
Washington
ago.
Post. And so there's a lot of them that are, and there's quite a lot who are doing things internationally, particularly in India. If you see a magazine called Caravan, which is a fabulous magazine that's kind of the best magazine published in English in India for serious journalism and literary journalism. That's a total MA grad production. Basharat Peer, who runs the India blog for the New York Times, is an MA politics grad and wrote a wonderful book called Curfewed Nights. There's,
Well, this is why not suggest we read before coming up here?
You will get lists from your seminar professors over the summer that are sort of specific to the concentration. Is there anything? I always advise people to read Jim Stewart's book about long-form reporting and nonfiction writing, because I just think
Follow the Story.
it's useful for the thesis. To even if you've looked at it before, it's worth revisiting.
One thing that I think is, it's not a book, but the person I'm replacing in the politics seminar, Tom Edsel, writes an online column every week for the New York Times that is fabulous, and it's really in the spirit of the MA program, because what he does is he marries political science research to what's going on in politics. There was a famous or infamous recent New York Times column by Nick Kristof in which he's complaining about academics, and which I thought was very bad column. But one of the things he says in there is the entire field of political science can be ignored because it has nothing, to contribute, that it doesn't address any real issues. And, in his own paper online is this wonderful column by Tom Edsel that gives the lie to that, because every single week he says, here's what's going on in political science that helps us understand what's going on in politics. And then there's a wonderful blog that started here, not at the J School, in the political science department, called Monkey Cage, that's now owned by the Washington Post. And that's kind of Tom's effort in reverse. That's political scientists trying to explain what's going on in the world. But both of those are great examples of a sort of bridge between how you can use expert knowledge to do better journalism and have a richer understanding of what's going on in the world.
For the art students, and actually for any of the students, I would highly recommend the book recently published by my colleague Elisa Solomon, who is the founder of the MA Arts Seminar. It's a book, it's a cultural history of Fiddler on the Roof called Miracle of Miracles. And it's an extraordinary work of both history, sociology, and critical analysis, all in like exquisite balance. It's the best thesis in the world in book form. So I'd highly recommend that.
So all of the seminars have sort of adapted, and David could maybe talk about what Arts and Culture has done, but all of them have sort of tried to bring the digitized world more into how people are covering things. In the fall, students did
we start out week one with the students covering an arts festival and filing on the class website, filing a variety of reports, interviews, profiles, blogs, and audio and video reports too, day one. And it's a very robust website that you can take a look at.
There's some ability to take courses outside the MA program inside the school that are digital skills oriented too.
Right. Each semester you have the option of taking a digital skills class in photography or video or.
And is Emily doing her thing in the fall?
Emily Bell, who's the director of the Tao Center here, teaches a class that all MA students take the second half of the fall called The Future of Journalism, which is really about kind of thinking about how to do journalism differently and how sort of technology and business models are changing journalism. And then this year in this spring, we have a new data journalism class that's an option for MA students. So typically MA students have to take 2 outside courses, but this semester you can opt to take that data class instead of one of those courses, and we'll probably have something similar next year. And we're actually also looking at ways to sort of integrate more data skills stuff into the fall. But I can't give you the specifics about that now, but if you want to write to me anytime in the next few weeks, I can try to answer. And that goes for anything. If you have any questions, I'm a good person to get in touch with, because I don't necessarily know the answers, but I usually know who will know them.
And also, feel free to email David or me, and we'll answer. Our email addresses are public information on the school site. So,
and we'll read the emails and we'll answer eventually.
Any other questions before I see there's some current MA students in the back, so.
Yeah, we're getting hauled off the stairs.
Yeah.
So we'll come on this
Well, thanks
stage.
much. I hope to see you all again. Bye.
Thanks.